Just before I get going, a reflection on sort of the last session and some of the discussion yesterday about the role of science and the changing role of science. And I always get really uncomfortable when I speak at meetings and I'm introduced as an expert because I don't feel like an expert. I feel like, the old adage that the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And to me, science is a process rather than a product. And I think we need to be really clear when we talk about the role of science, the role of information, that, and I think we can all think of lots of examples where the science, per se, as a product, maybe didn't fit the need at the time and turned out to be wrong. But science is a process of learning is a different thing altogether. And I think that's what we're embarking on as part of the group here and trying to embrace other partners is sort of this continual process of learning and challenging, recognizing uncertainty, trying to address those uncertainties over time. So today's all about how, and I just love this cartoon. But, we can think about the present, which is already pretty complicated, and the future, and the desired future in particular, which is unlikely to be any less complicated. It's probably even more complicated, and we're in this position of trying to figure out how to get there. And one gentleman saying to the other here, I think we should be more explicit here in step 2. So we have this aspiration for the future in terms of reducing negative impacts of climate change. We'll talk a lot about that, but in maintaining certain values over time and even enhancing certain values over time. So how do we get there? And yesterday I talked about different paradigms in conservation and introduced you to some sort of new thinking around how we conceptualize landscapes, in particular how we think about the matrix in landscapes, and this model which we've come to term the conservation matrix model, and really recognizing the value that these large, extensive, and relatively intact landscapes have in terms of maintaining values across areas, and how we can manage to sustain those values over time. And I broke it down into elements of the conservation matrix model, and I'm going to talk a little bit more today about a couple of aspects of this. But what I want to say first is really sort of building on some of the themes that were discussed yesterday, but also this morning in particular. I mean, really this is kind of a hybrid approach of zonation and adaptation strategies. And adaptation strategies both to present stressors, but also then future stressors or growing stressors in the form of climate change. But we have put a lot of emphasis thus far really in terms of our thinking of the stressors that we're already seeing today. And that was my comment yesterday, and Jim mentioned it in his presentation as well. Let's not lose track of the fact that we have many other existing stressors that may actually be a lot easier to manage than climate change, can I say. Yes, Chris. Right, yes, and I had another slide that had Conservation Matrix 3 on it. Just to acknowledge that. Well, okay, so here essentially, the whole landscape is what we're referring to as the conservation matrix, embedded in which are other sorts of elements. And here I've essentially depicted as conservation matrix 2 because we've got this management zone that where we have explicitly identified the achievement of other objectives as perhaps a principal function for that landscape, such as in the allocation of a forest tenure or mineral claims or something like that. And so we recognize that there are other objectives being simultaneously managed, and that there is perhaps a higher degree of uncertainty and risk associated then with that component of the landscape matrix because of those other objectives. That was a very simplistic depiction, but that's what those 1, 2, 3, and you could imagine any number of levels if you like. But we're not writing it off as not being part of the conservation matrix, we're just giving it that different explicit. So the conservation matrix, and we recognize various roles that it plays, and then it's very important to sustain those roles over time. what I'm going to talk a little bit about are the ecological benchmarks that I referred to yesterday that serve a number of roles, and only really a few of them are referenced here. But the idea of them being ecological reference sites for understanding the dynamics of natural systems and the response to human activities, assurance policies for managing risk. I mentioned yesterday that these are not to be conceived as sort of static points in time. We're not talking about using them as a retrospective or historic benchmark, but rather as dynamic living laboratories, if you like. And aside, these are very sort of general qualities that we would like these ecological benchmarks to have, to be relatively unaltered, to be representative of ecological variation, and sufficiently large to maintain key ecological processes. And that's what I'm going to speak a little bit to today in terms of elaborating some of those criteria a little bit more and talking about how they've been applied. And so I had the slide yesterday, but I didn't speak to it at all. Here are sort of the qualities. Yeah, sorry, we're out of order here. Well, never mind. Okay, maybe I can jump forward. There we go. So the emphasis in our thinking around ecological benchmarks has been very much tied to ecological processes that shape these landscapes at large scales, and in particular flows like major water flows, hydrological flows that shape landscapes, and natural disturbance agents such as fire and insect outbreaks. And so going back then, we can think about properties of these ecological benchmarks being intact. So a proxy for that essentially is that a low conspicuous human footprint, if you like, in these areas. And by human footprint, I don't mean the absence of all humans in landscapes, but the sort of conspicuous landscape change that one can see on satellite images. So the sort of data that Matt showed this morning in the ALCES projections, where you can see that conspicuous alteration of environments by humans. Another important property of ecological benchmarks is that they should have high hydrological connectivity, essentially. Also be of sufficient size, and I'm going to speak a little bit more to these properties and representative of environmental variation. And if they meet all these criteria, we refer to them as system-level ecological benchmarks. Now, hydrological connectivity is also obviously very important for lots of animals. We talked about salmon a few times during this workshop, and Molly used the example of hydrological connectivity or maintaining water flow across landscapes. And so they also help us think about meaningful ecological boundaries as well. And so within our conceptualization of ecological benchmarks or benchmarks across boreal regions in Canada in particular, we've identified water catchments as planning units or building blocks. And these are essentially assembled from digital elevation models and drainage networks to identify catchments. And those are what we use then as units of assessment in looking both at ecological benchmarks, but also looking at other components of the landscape. And so we've got these individual catchments, and each of these stream segments has a flow network associated, or a flow associated with it. And that allows us to identify things like headwaters and the connectivity and what the upstream and downstream effects are likely to be from any sort of activity on this landscape. So we use that information in terms of evaluating ecological benchmarks. Another important criteria is the size of ecological benchmarks, thinking about that. And we've identified what we call minimum dynamic reserves. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but essentially these are derived from, at the bottom here, dynamic landscape simulation of vegetation succession and fire. And essentially the question is, what is the minimum area required to maintain internal recolonization sources for flammable vegetation types over time? And so there's initialization of the models, there's simulations, multiple simulations over 100 years, because these are, of course, stochastic processes. And the outcome of that is this hexagon map of boreal regions of Canada, essentially, that illustrates what the minimum dynamic resistance is for each of those units. And this becomes a target then for the assessment of ecological benchmarks. And then in looking at representation, we're again looking at very sort of broad scales, and this is, classic sort of force filter type analysis. And there's four primary biophysical criteria that we've been using, if you like. One is climate moisture index, and we use this explicitly to allow us to bridge looking at climate change type scenarios. Gross primary productivity, assessment of land cover, and also metrics that we generate, which is referred to lakehead density, or as a colleague of mine, Steve Cummings says, this is a measure of sort of riparianicity of these different areas. So it's looking at the interface between the terrestrial and the aquatic, recognizing that these are sort of very special components of the landscape. So these are broad criteria that we use in the evaluation of ecological benchmarks. And we've now applied this then to an evaluation across boreal regions in Canada, so including the Yukon and portions of northern BC. And one of the things we've done is evaluate the ability of the existing protected areas network to serve as ecological benchmarks. So ideally, our protected areas, our existing protected areas could serve the role of ecological benchmarks, but they weren't designed to do that for the most part. Even though they're often promoted as being able to do that. They actually weren't designed to do that. So this is what the existing protected areas network looks like in Canada. And this includes both the legally designated areas, which are in dark brown there, in boreal regions of Canada, and the interim or proposed areas. And the interim or proposed areas aren't just ones that have shown up in any sort of, conservation plan or something like that. They actually have some level of government sponsorship. So you can see it's a pretty distributed network, and there's high degree of variability in size, and you can see how some of these are, obviously like historic rivers and things like that, protect areas around those. And if you actually apply then that suite of criteria that I mentioned to the existing protected areas network, the bottom line on this is that anything that is in yellow or warmer shades of orange and red meet the criteria for system-level ecological benchmarks, and the others don't. And this is already a subset that meet the minimum impact criteria. So we've got some ability to utilize the existing protected areas network to serve as ecological benchmarks, but some really major gaps as well. And we've stratified this by ecological regions and hydrological units and looked at it in various different ways. And that is part of what I didn't actually speak to it yesterday, something that's called a Pan-boreal assessment that we just completed across Canada. And the results of that are all being made available on a web-based platform and broken down by strata, ecological strata, and hydrological units. So from ecozones down to ecoregions, that's defined as ecological unit, and from the major drainage basins, ocean drainage basins, down to sub-drainage basins. Okay, that's a slide that was out of order. I'm sorry. Yeah, we do. I do have some slides out of order here. We've generated a number of custom software tools, if you like, or modeling platforms that allow us to do this kind of evaluation of ecological benchmarks and other evaluations of landscapes. Some of the tools are sort of analogous to some of the work that Matt Carlson talked about this morning with OSCE, but on a much more tactical level. But for example, we generated a software platform called Benchmark Builder, which allows one to actually generate potential ecological benchmarks along these drainage networks. So you start with the headwater and it builds out from those to identify ecological benchmarks. And we have a spatially explicit simulation model called Conserve, which does essentially the same sorts of things that Matt was talking about this morning with respect to being able to evaluate cumulative effects, but we're using it mainly for ecological functions here, looking at vegetation trajectories over time and building in species models, and then also landscape change as desired. But as opposed to ALICES, it is spatially explicit. So it's not, ALICES, as we saw this morning, is an aspatial tool at its terms of coarse resolution. Its mapping function is just imposing those algorithms in sort of a prescribed format across the landscape, but it's not actually cognizant of the spatial relationship between existing landscape elements. This tool is fully spatially explicit in that regard. And then a number of others, software and analytical tools. And these are also ones that we're making available online as well. None of these are proprietary. So I showed this map yesterday just to illustrate what the existing benchmark potential, if you like, is across the boreal to meet the most stringent criteria. And the composite areas of the buffy colored thing is the aggregate area benchmark. And this just shows a network of benchmarks for one area that meets those criteria for ecological representation both now and into the future. And into the future, at present, this includes a simulation of fire regimes into the future, not the climate projections, but we are incorporating those now as well. Obviously somewhat more complex in terms of choosing which climate scenarios to use and those sorts of things. But the capability certainly exists to look at the ability of these areas to capture that environmental variation both now and into the future. So that's all I want to say about benchmarks, just to sort of give you a sense of where some of the capacity, I guess, and thinking on that is going. I wanted to talk about then sort of the other end of the conservation matrix model, which is how we think about management of sites where we're undertaking direct activities. And so here's where we have the conservation matrix 3. So we've now identified within an area that may have been allocated as a forest 10 years. What do you call it in the U.S.? Okay, so forest, sure. And so within this, you could imagine, this is a forest tenure, these are individual catwalks, and that they've got some buffering around them, recognizing that we've now taken certain activities on these landscapes, which maybe increase our uncertainty and outcomes. But the principle here in the conservation matrix model is that those activities must be undertaken in an incremental way. Again, we talked about this yesterday, so you don't want to postpone future opportunities by sort of doing everything in one fell swoop. And that you're done as part of an adaptive management framework, and that effectiveness monitoring is a really key element of this. And so a really important aspect, and I think, Molly, I think you referred to this someone else. But thinking about sort of the what, where, when, and how of how we undertake different activities as being really important. And this may seem, totally intuitive to us. But from a conservation perspective, the conservation community has spent an awful lot of time thinking about how do we design protected areas, what do their qualities need to be, and largely sort of ignoring what's going on in the non-protected components of the landscape. And we just simply can't afford to do that. So we need to be spending just as much time thinking about what kind of activities are appropriate, where should they be undertaken, at what time, and what are the specific management techniques that might be applied. And I gave some examples yesterday of some innovations in that regard. And these also represent, of course, huge opportunities for knowledge gain if they're designed carefully and designed such a way that we can learn from them. And, certainly they can help us both to identify and reduce uncertainties and also to try and maximize the likelihood that we actually have the desired outcome and particularly to avoid irreversible negative effects and really to encourage innovation as well. So this is a part of engaging the broader community really in the discussion about how do we maintain the conservation value of these large intact landscapes. Now I want to spend just a few minutes talking about some of the ways in which we can use policy as hypothesis. And Annette, I think you had that in your presentation yesterday. It was a quote from, I think, a Carl's paper on this, where he talks about policy and hypothesis management of experiments. This is the National Recovery Strategy for Woodland Caribou Boreal Ecotype in Canada. It was released, the final version of it was released last year. And this slide is reformatted a bit, so I apologize. I'm going to spend just a minute or two explaining to you what this is actually doing. But basically, underlying theme here is that ultimately the National Recovery Strategy ended up adopting essentially a threshold approach to managing disturbance on boreal caribou ranges. And that has become a way of basically establishing the recovery criteria. And so we've got the recovery objective here on this axis, which is the recovery objective is having self-sustaining populations of caribou throughout their existing distribution, so in currently occupied caribou ranges. And so that's on this axis, and here we have the total disturbance within caribou ranges. So Matt presented some information on this morning that was generated for the province of Alberta, essentially, and he had the intrinsic rate of increase, and so he was referring to 0.99 as being low risk, and 0.95 to 0.95 to 99 being moderate risk, and lower than 0.95 being high risk. So here, what essentially this is the probability of achieving a 0.99 intrinsic rate of increase or higher. And this is derived from a series of analyses based on empirical data. This, in fact, had data on demographic response for 25 populations, but half of the population is across Canada, for which population data actually exists. And that was related to the amount of disturbance on a range, and this is a component of industrial disturbance and fire. And the recovery strategy used this underlying relationship then, or this response surface, to identify a management threshold. So as you can see, there is no particular really discrete inflection point on this relationship. Basically, as you increase the amount of disturbance, you decrease the probability that you actually achieve your recovery. But the federal government wanted to choose a particular management threshold, and so they said, okay, well, we're going to choose a 60% probability of achieving a self-sustaining population, which corresponds to maintaining 65% undisturbed habitat. Now, this quickly sort of got forgotten. This number corresponded to a 60% probability, but this has now been set as the recovery criteria, essentially. So jurisdictions that have caribou populations are now to manage either to maintain or restore a minimum of 65% undisturbed habitat. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but of course, there's variability in the empirical data that underlies this relationship, quite a bit, as it turns out. About 70% of the variation in caribou demographic condition or population status is explained by the composite value of industrial disturbance and fire. But these now show the prediction intervals around that. And what you can see is that at this recovery management threshold of 65% undisturbed habitat, there's considerable variability. And what this means is that it's quite possible to satisfy the recovery criteria but fail to meet the recovery objective altogether. Conversely, it may also be possible to achieve much better conservation outcomes at the same, if you like, habitat cost. So it reduces ecological risk. So you could actually have a much higher probability of sustaining the population at that level. And this has to do with the underlying variation in the data and uncertainty around the precise conditions under which we do better or worse than expected. So a real opportunity, if you like, is to undertake management activities, allow them as experiments, to really better appreciate how we can be above the curve here. How can we choose, how can we realize better outcomes than expected? And just another example of how we sort of often take general relationships and forget about the underlying uncertainty or variability in them. This is essentially a yield curve from a forest management plan for boreal tenure, forest tenure, of course, in boreal regions of Canada. And this is for a mixed wood stand, and it's showing the volume by stand age relationship for aspen, which is the AW, the yellow line, and fruit. And you can see here on the top, so this is the generalized relationship between the timber supply analysis. But if you actually look at the underlying empirical data, again, you see that there's a huge amount of variability in it. And so we can ask the same question when we're undertaking management activities in that management zone, if you like, as part of the conservation matrix model, is how can we achieve much better economic outcomes at the same subtext cost, if you like. So if we assume that when we implement conservation measures, that sometimes the outcome of that is a reduction in timber supply, or a reduction in the amount of land available for other uses. And that's often quantified in boreal regions of Canada's timber supply, where we undertake forest management activities. How can we actually achieve better outcomes through stratification of the landscape or through the introduction of model management methods? So lots of latitude here for doing a lot better than we have in the past, I guess, is the bottom line here. But to help us understand what the most profitable, if you like, not profitable from an economic sense, profitable from a knowledge gain sense, avenues might be for active adaptive management, we need to understand something about the pathways. And we've used the term pathways a number of times in this workshop. We also refer them as impact hypothesis diagrams from sort of a scientific perspective. Molly showed a relationship like this, where a conceptual model for the water flow effects that we looked at this morning. This is just one for Caribou, and it's a very simplistic one, but basically, showing the relationship or hypothesized relationship between drivers and response, the ultimate response are here being Caribou numbers. And the arrows are meant to, the thickness of the arrows, if you like, are meant to say something about the magnitude of response. So this helps us to understand where we might want to manipulate the system in order to manage trajectories, and how that can help us learn over time. And here's just an illustration of how we're trying to do this at very large spatial extents across Canada. These are the areas that I showed yesterday that are part of the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement. So there's 76 million hectares across Canada. And here I've just circled three general regions, 1, 2, 3. And corresponding with them are the measures of anthropogenic disturbance and fire. So these are the two variables that go into that Caribou response model that I showed, from which we derived the relationship that we done as part of the National Recovery Strategy. And so you can see that between these three general areas, there's quite a bit of variability in terms of, for example, the proportion of disturbance that's accounted for by fire rather than anthropogenic disturbance, and as well as the total amount. And if you drill down into this even further, and you probably can't see those numbers from the back, but you'll see that within a given group, so within the individual population ranges within the CBSA group 1, as I call it there, that the anthropogenic disturbance actually ranges from 20 to 95%, and the fire disturbance ranges from 0 to 31%. Well, this allows us to do the kind of spatial stratification that was referred to this morning, actually, in terms of using the existing variability on landscapes to help us understand how we might learn more, accelerate our learning about the response of these systems. And so what we're trying to do now is actually design an active adaptive management experiment across this very large area to use the existing contrasting conditions to help us understand that question of how can we stay above the curve, how can we achieve better outcomes than we would expect on average. So one way I might characterize the conservation matrix model is just, very simply, if I explain it, someone to say, well, it's really all about carefully planned and managed activities within a matrix of conservation land. That's kind of a very simple interpretation of it. And so here now we're looking at the LCC that we're talking about during this workshop and that all of you are actively engaged with. So what are some of the ways in which this concept of the conservation matrix model might actually apply within the LCC? And I put this one in to remind me actually just to talk about the variability that exists within the LCC in terms of perhaps the maturity of land use planning processes and also existing contrasting conditions. This is the Yukon, and these are the land use planning regions in the Yukon. And the green areas are the existing protected areas. So you can see that actually there's not a large amount of land protected in the Yukon right now. I think it's about 11%. And you can see that it's very much aggregated in a few discrete areas. So in the southwest of the Yukon, this is mainly Swan National Park and Reserve, and up in the north Yukon, actually in the Arctic region, Abavic and Wittenput Territorial Park. And then a few other areas, but there's certainly a large proportion for which there isn't much in the way of existing protected areas. And these land use planning regions were an outcome of the umbrella final agreement between First Nations and the government. And that is essentially the document that actions land use planning in the Yukon Territory. And that agreement was finalized 20 years ago. And there's a chapter in it that speaks specifically to land use planning, and there were certainly high expectations and aspirations at the time for what land use planning was going to achieve in terms of actually realizing the desires of the First Nations as part of their land claim settlement. But it has been a painfully slow process. There is actually only one approved land use plan in the Yukon, and that's for the North Yukon here. Which was arguably one of the least contentious areas for them to start. And then there's one pending, which is the Peel Watershed Plan, which I know a few people here at least are aware of, and which there's been some discussion of. And the final land use plan for the Peel was a result of 7 years of planning commission, consulting with local communities, and going through a fairly lengthy process of proposing a plan, revising a plan, and then presenting the final plan to the territorial government. And then it's been sitting in limbo now for about 2 years without an official response from the Yukon government. So that's sitting in hold right now. And then there's one other ongoing process in the Dawson region, which is here's Dawson here, so Fairbanks system is up here. So the Dawson planning region here, and they started about a year ago, or a year and a half ago now, I guess, and are hoping to have a draft in the next 5 months. But in the meantime, over the last 20 years, of course, there have been lots of activities in this region, and a couple of years ago, when I first met with this group, I think, I presented an animated version of staking in the Yukon. This is a more static depiction. We have seen a huge surge in claim staking in the Yukon over the past 5 or 6 years. And some of that earlier and really precipitated by the announcement of the land use planning process in the field. There was a huge surge in staking at that time as well. But my point here really is just that in the absence of land use planning, we're seeing, potential expansion of opportunities as these kinds of allocations are being made. So there's a real need to sort of accelerate land use planning in the Yukon, or at least have some careful thought going into what we might aspire to in some of these landscapes. And I want to contrast this with the situation in Alaska, because I think you have a longer history of land planning, land use planning in Alaska. You certainly have a much larger proportion of landscape under protection at present. And so the starting point for sort of consideration of conservation planning in those two areas, if you like, of the larger LCC are quite different. And then we get into different situations as well in northern BC and the Northwest Territories. So this puts us sort of in a different space in thinking about the conservation matrix model as well and its application to the LCC. I just wanted to sort of complete this really with posing some questions and perhaps potential actions for the LCC relative to thinking about application of the conservation matrix model, and very much this is just to stimulate discussion. I think it'll be really important to identify and sustain the functions of the conservation matrix. So I think everybody recognizes that this is a very different sort of environment, if you like, for conservation planning than where a lot of the conservation science was developed and thoughts about conservation networks in more southern altered systems. But maintaining the values and processes across this large planning region will be really important to maintain those options, to maintain the resilience over time and the adaptive capacity. I think it is a real opportunity to identify a network of ecological benchmarks and associated monitoring strategies. And that, I think, there's sort of two thrusts there. I think it would be very interesting to undertake an analysis of the existing protected areas network in Alaska with respect to the identification of ecological benchmarks. And then as a parallel effort to look at the other regions of the LCC to look at their potential as well. And those would be probably more in the form of proposing new areas as opposed to counting on the existing protected areas network, which is pretty slim there. There's a real opportunity as well to accelerate understanding of the drivers of change through active adaptive management. And I talked about that yesterday and a bit today, and the theme that sort of has come through a number of the presentations. And I think in Molly's presentation, she had very much the same depiction in terms of the climate change scenario analysis. Is very much part of an adaptive cycle, just as we can look at other forms of management and adaptive management. I also think, and I think this is my final point here, that it would be, and Carrie mentioned this morning in a slightly different context, but identifying and leveraging the contributions of the partners in working towards shared goals across this large landscape. So what are the individual contributions that agencies can make, and how can those build up collectively to management across these large landscapes, and where are the significant gaps, I guess, in management authority, if you like, in terms of realizing the aspirational goals of the LCC, whether they stand as that or something slightly revised. Discussion yesterday about perhaps revisions to the vision statement, but just broadly speaking, there's some really aspirational goals there, and how can the individual partners within the LCC contribute to those? And if I relate it back to the conservation matrix model, who among the partners has jurisdiction, if you like, or authority to be thinking about ecological benchmarks? Who can be thinking about management of the matrix over that large area in terms of the opportunities for adaptive management experiments? Mike was talking yesterday about the refuge being used as a control, but he didn't want to use the term control as a reference area for wolf control in the adjacent area. So even though the refuge is not undertaking active management or active adaptive management, they're very much part of that process of informing it because they have the ability to serve as a reference for that. And so starting to build some of these linkages across the various partners in the LCC, and also identifying where the gaps exist, where you might want to think about, engaging, how you might engage additional partners to realize this very aspirational vision, I think is an important exercise. So that's where I'm going to leave things off. I spoke for longer than I intended, and I apologize for being a little bit disturbed because I was out of order there, but maybe